Everyone, Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Thursday, February 15th, 2024. Colonel Douglas Macgregor joins us now. Colonel, welcome back to the show. Always a pleasure, my dear friend. Over the weekend, Colonel, the Senate of the United States passed and sent on to the House of Representatives a foreign aid package, which includes money for Taiwan and Israel. But I want to talk to you right now about the $61 billion it includes for Ukraine. I understand that some of this is cash, which must be spent in 2025 by whoever is president from and after January 20th, 2025, an interesting constitutional loop. But a lot of it, of course, is equipment. Question, how depleted is the Ukraine military, and of what value would this kind of aid be, even if it does pass the House and is signed by President Biden?
Well, to answer your question, keep in mind that much of what is being promised with the $61 billion will in fact not arrive for well over a year, maybe longer. We are not sending things that we already have on hand. We're sending things that we have to build. Our stocks are very, very low. We've sent about everything we can, so have the Europeans. So I don't think this has as much to do with Ukraine as most Americans think. Certainly, it's helping to maintain the facade that there is a viable government in Kiev that exerts some control over the country. I don't think it really does any longer. I think things are really simply falling apart. The military leadership is composed of people who are planning what I would call vengeance attacks, use missiles, drones, whatever they can find to harm Russians, primarily inside Russia. And then they're being helped by the SAS on the British side and others to launch the kinds of attacks you saw down in the Black Sea. None of them make any difference. None of them are going to change anything. So the first point to take away from this is most of this money is designed to enrich donors and keep assembly lines humming, which obviously is good for constituents. Doesn't do anything for the United States per se. I don't think it's helpful to us in the least. Strategically, it's self-defeating. But it keeps the Europeans in the game, so to say, as long as they stay in power, that is the globalist neocon elites. And it keeps us in the game, as you point out. But none of it's going to work. None of it's going to make any difference. Between now and then, the debt grows, our position weakens financially. Nothing good comes from it.
Here's the neocon position. This will irritate you, but not surprise you, I'm sure. It's a clip from Senator Mitt Romney on the floor of the Senate shortly before the vote on Sunday evening.
If we fail to help Ukraine, Putin will invade a NATO nation. He may delay his next invasion until he rebuilds his decimated military. But we must be clear-eyed. Ukraine is not the end. It is a step. If we fail to help Ukraine, China will eventually absorb Taiwan. If we fail to help Ukraine, NATO, the alliance that's prevented great power conflict for over 75 years, will falter and eventually disintegrate.
If that is the understanding, I'm not even going to talk about which party, although he's a Republican, or at least nominally. If that is the understanding of the Congress, it is totally divorced from reality, is it not?
Oh, I'd say so. The thing I most admire about Mitt Romney is his choice of suits, ties, the way he looks, how carefully his hair is managed. I mean, the man always looks tremendous, but he can't say anything without notes in front of him. And he's always reading from something that someone else wrote for him. I don't know what the man actually believes. It's all nonsense. It sounded to me like a more eloquent version of LBJ telling everyone that if we fail in South Vietnam, the Chinese and the Russians are going to march into Malaysia and all the way to Australia. It's sort of ridiculous.
But what is the significance of firing General Zaluzhny and hiring his replacement, the one they call, forgive me, his name is escaping me, Sarsky?
Seriously.
The one that his own troops refer to as the butcher of Bakhmut, from the way apparently he has treated his own men.
You know, this is a strange one. As I understand it, the Syrskyi's family actually lives inside Russia.
Hmm.
Family is not living in Ukraine. Not all of it, but a substantial portion of it. So that's the first odd dimension to this whole thing. Second thing is I'm told that he's really an instrument of MI6 in London and to a lesser extent the CIA. And Zelensky's running out of people who are loyalists, running out of anybody who's willing to follow his insane orders. And since the army itself is being rendered incapable of serious combat, thanks to all the casualties and losses, I think we're dealing with generals who are going to sign up for what I talked about earlier, these pointless attacks where the objective is to simply kill Russians, harm Russians, destroy Russian infrastructure. So I think that's about it. How long is this going to last? Well, you got to go back to Tucker's interview. And I think if there's one criticism I have for Vladimir Putin, one serious one, is that he's somewhat naive. I think he still believes that there's someone somewhere who's going to sign an agreement and help him end this war. I don't think it's going to happen.
So how does the war end when the government totally and completely collapses and there's no place for American aid to go?
Yeah, I think what President Putin has got to decide is how much longer he wants to wait for change in Europe. I mean, I'm still baffled by the fact that the same stooges are in charge in Berlin.
Right.
There's one place that should have changed quickly. It's Berlin. But the Germans have demonstrated that they're willing to endure tremendous deprivation and harm to their own country under the leadership of this government. So, until that happens, I don't know who Putin's going to talk to. The government in Poland right now is kind of an EU transplant. I think there's a higher probability of that being removed in Poland before the Germans finally wake up and remove the people in Berlin. So I don't know what he's going to do. I think he's going to have to make a decision. Do I continue to waste time on this battlefield with the remnants of the Ukrainian military because I don't want to kill people, because he really doesn't? Or do I just march to the Dnieper and then prepare to cross it and go into Kiev? Now, we all know that the plan is to leave Kiev and go to Lvov in Western Ukraine. But at least that robs this government of any last remaining shred of credibility or legitimacy, because they can't defend themselves and they have nothing with which to resist the Russians. So I think that's one way it could end. I don't see too many others, because it's very obvious that we're not going to talk to him. And Judge, as we've said before, why would Moscow listen to anything we said?
Right. Well, you remember what he said to what President Putin said to Tucker when he asked him if he would call Joe Biden. Do we have that clip, Chris? Watch this.
And so why don't you just call Biden and say, let's work this out?
What's there to work out? It's very simple. I repeat, we have contacts through various agencies. I will tell you what we are saying on this matter and what we are conveying to the US leadership. If you really want to stop fighting, you need to stop supplying weapons. It will be over within a few weeks. That's it. And then we can agree on some terms. Before you do that, stop. What's easier? Why would I call him? What should I talk to him about? Or beg him for what?
And what messages do you get back?
You're going to deliver such and such weapons to Ukraine? Oh, I'm afraid, please don't. What is there to talk about?
I thought that was a great answer for him. But you notice whose name he didn't mention is Vladimir Zelensky. The war will be over when Joe Biden picks up the phone. There's nothing Zelensky can do about it. Your thoughts on what we just saw, Colonel?
Well, he knows that Zelensky's a puppet. Zelensky is many things, but he's not a total fool. And that's why he was ready to sign up for that agreement that we went out of our way to crush with the help of Boris Johnson. And remember, I think Zelensky was told privately by everyone that spoke to him, whether it was Lindsey Graham or anybody else from Washington, D.C. or London, you stick with us. We'll provide you with everything. You will have the entire scientific, industrial, and military might of NATO and the United States behind you. You cannot lose. I think he bought it and decided to stick it out. And it was very obvious to him when he came back to the United States on more than one occasion to discover that whatever he thought he was going to get, he's not going to get. And there's not much that we can do for him. I mean, you can't build armies on the fly. We've talked about that.
Right.
That's absurd nonsense.
But can President Zelensky really enter into negotiations without fear of an assassination from the Banderites and the Nazis in his own military and security staff?
Well, I think the British have done probably the best job of securing his life. He's got British special ops types around him. So I think that's his ticket to survival at the moment. Will somebody get through and remove him? I have no idea. I have frankly expected a general officer or two from inside the Ukrainian army watching the debacle to finally step forward and say, that's it. Turn his force around and march on Kiev. It hasn't happened. I suspect they too are on the take. Everybody in Ukraine swims in a sea of corruption. Everyone is benefiting except the Ukrainian people. So I think the generals and the colonels are probably going to go along with this until somebody stops paying them.
Let's switch gears over to the Middle East. You and I emailed each other earlier today about the significance of the meeting in Cairo between Turkish President Erdogan and Egyptian President al-Sisi. What do you think they talked about and maybe agreed to? They were together for 2 days.
I think it's important for Americans to know that they have not really had government to government discussions and relations for 13 years. If you go back 13 years ago, you discover that we and the British, but I think more importantly, the Israelis, worked together to ensure that Mr. Morsi, who was legitimately elected, did not become president of Egypt. He was regarded as a Muslim Brotherhood member, an Islamist, and potentially dangerous to Israel, and certainly unwilling to do the bidding of the United States. So we did everything in our power to bring General Sisi into office, where he's resided ever since. This has been very problematic for Sisi because although he wants to be thought of as an Egyptian nationalist and as an Egyptian patriot, he has this baggage, which is not very good. Now, President Erdogan strongly supported Morsi. President Erdogan leads the Muslim Brotherhood in North America and de facto in the Middle East. He is seen as its head. Now he's finally buried the hatchet with Sisi, and Sisi's buried the hatchet with him. Why would they do this now? Well, there are two things. Both of them have an interest in sorting out the access to oil and natural gas in the Mediterranean, particularly in regard to events in Libya. Remember, we destabilized Libya, caused a terrible civil war. Lots of people have been killed. Lots of fighting has taken place. They realize that this fighting needs to end and a peaceful solution needs to emerge in Libya. So that's a long-term issue. But something else has happened, and that's the campaign in Gaza. Egypt is now in a very, very delicate and vulnerable position because the Egyptians have made it clear that if the Israelis attack Rafah and they go into the so-called Philadelphia corridor, the space between Gaza and Egypt, which under the treaty that reaches back to the 73 war, is ultimately their responsibility. That is Egypt's responsibility. If that is somehow or another violated by the Israelis, technically that's regarded as an act of war. On the other hand, the Egyptian spokesman and the foreign ministry have come out and said, well, we haven't said we'll go to war. That's not quite what we mean. And now we have this pending ground offensive on Rafah, which everybody recognizes, as King Abdullah in Jordan pointed out, that's going to kill tens of thousands of people. We don't know how many people it will kill, but could kill 100,000. You already have 500,000 people that are on the verge of starvation. You have huge problems with water purification, disease. This is just quote unquote icing on the cake that's going to make life there that much more terrible. He wants to do something, but he doesn't want to do it on his own. And I'm quite certain that he and President Erdogan spoke about this in great detail. Erdogan I suspect, has told Sisi, we will stand by you. We will support you. We'll see. Mr. Erdogan was the gentleman at the final press conference who talked about Gaza. And he was very clear in his condemnation of what the Israelis have done and had really warned them against doing more of it. Sisi said nothing about it publicly.
Right.
He stood on the side and watched. So remember, Turkey is the de facto leader of the Sunni Muslim world in military terms and increasingly in political terms. So I think some agreements were reached in private in April, and April-May timeframe is when some of your listeners will remember that I predicted that you would see this begin to take on the dimensions of a true regional war. Sisi and Erdogan will meet in Turkey. We'll see where we are then. But I think this is the beginning of a coalescing alliance across the region.
And I have not heard this anywhere but from you. The mainstream media just acts like this was a social meeting between them. I thank you for the insight that you have given us. Do you honestly think that the Egyptians and the Turks would use military might to resist or repel the IDF from Gaza, particularly if it kills another group of 10,000 or 20,000 people? It's already killed more than 30,000.
As we've said before, Judge, no government in the region except Israel wants a war. None of the governments do in the Islamic world, particularly the Arab states, whose societies are fragile. They understand what a war with Israel would mean because it probably involves us. And they're looking at serious damage to the infrastructure that will be very difficult to rebuild. So the governments, that is, the ruling elites, don't want a war. The problem is their populations do. When I say they want a war, what I'm saying is that the populations are enraged. Somebody sent me a note recently from Cairo and said, well, there aren't hundreds of thousands of people in the street. But he said, no one here has stopped talking about Gaza. And everyone here is in agreement that Israel has to be removed from the map. If it isn't, they threaten the very existence of everyone in the region. Now, this is a change. Sure, we've always had blowhards that said things about, well, we'll wipe Israel off the map when we don't want this or that. This is not the same thing. This is a growing consensus in all of these states that something must be done about Israel. This is why I've worried from the very beginning, and I was very opposed to this because I want Israel to survive. I'm afraid that they won't.
Has the United States exacerbated or hastened this by the 85 or 86 military assaults that Joe Biden ordered in the past 2 weeks in retaliation for the death of 3 Georgia National Guardsmen and the injury of 42 others?
I think we've done much more than that. I think our failure to exert any real influence in Israel over the Israeli leadership to do anything differently. In fact, we've doubled down and increased our support, not just military support, but also monetary support for the Israeli economy. All of these things send a message to everyone in the region that we have no moral turpitude, that we have no use for Arab life, no use for Muslim life. That's the unambiguous signal. So I think our position in the region is in serious trouble. I think you're going to see Jordan, Egypt, you've already got Iraq and Syria that want us out of their countries. We've decided to ignore it. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that we're building a large base at Erbil in northern Iraq that could serve as the future concentration point for U.S. military power in the region as we withdraw from lower Iraq. So I think it's the only thing that the 85 targets did was reinforce what everybody thinks, which is that we are Israel's staunch ally, but more important, we're going to do whatever the Israelis want us to do. And I think it's finishing us in the Muslim world in the Middle East.
Will any amount, now I'm going to prevail upon your astute brain for American politics, not Republican or Democrat, but your thumb on the pulse of the public, will any amount of Israeli horror change American public opinion. For example, in the past week, we have seen on video a Palestinian captive tortured by an IDF person with Israeli civilians watching and filming it. They all claimed that he was a Hamas leader, but then, of course, they let him go. If he was a Hamas person, they're not going to let him go. We have seen Itamar Ben-Gvir, the head of the Israeli security forces, roughly the equivalent of the director of our CIA, saying any Palestinian women or children who get too close to the border of Gaza and Israel should get a bullet to their heads. And we have seen also on tape Israeli IDF motioning Gaza ambulance drivers, it's okay to pick up these people that we just shot, and then when they get out of the ambulance, they get assassinated, murdered on the streets. Does any of this rebut or weaken the iron grip that AIPAC has on the Congress?
Not really. First, most Americans aren't engaged. They're not watching carefully. Secondly, the mainstream media is deeply ingrained with support for Israel. They're not going to show most of these pictures or film footage that you're referring to. They're certainly not going to talk about it at any length. So I don't think much of that information is going to reach very many people. The one thing that disturbs Americans right now, and with good reason, by the way, is the massive amount of money in this bill that is headed overseas to Ukraine, to Israel, and to Taiwan. And they're wondering why nothing is being done about the border. Why is nothing being done to enforce our federal laws? Why is nothing being done to stop the criminality in our cities? Why do they wake up every morning and find that people that have shot at policemen or raped other people are suddenly being released back into the general population? That's where Americans are focused. They're very, very focused on the border right now, much more so than they are in anything happening overseas. So I think the short answer to your question is no, this is not going to change anything in the short run.
I thought of you this week. I don't live too far from a special congressional election on Long Island, a district that is sometimes Republican, but sometimes Democrat in terms of the member of Congress. It's George Santos's district.
Right.
The Republicans picked a former IDF fighter, a female, who was born in Ethiopia and is now an American citizen. The Democrats picked a moderate Democrat who sounded like Governor Abbott of Texas on the border. And guess what? He triumphed by 10 points.
Mm-hmm.
So you have your finger on something there, Colonel. I want you to watch the King of Jordan speaking in front of Joe Biden. Tell me if you think Joe Biden expected to hear this, if the king said what Joe wanted to say, or if Joe even understood what he was hearing.
Nearly 100,000 people have been killed, injured, or are missing. The majority are women and children. We cannot afford an Israeli attack on Rafah. It is certain to produce another humanitarian catastrophe. The situation is already unbearable for over 1 million people who have been pushed into Rafah since the war started. We cannot stand by and let this continue. We need a lasting ceasefire now. This war must end. We must urgently and immediately work to ensure the sustainable delivery of sufficient aid to Gaza through all possible entry points and mechanisms. And I thank you, Mr. President, for your support on this. Restrictions on vital relief aid and medical items are leading to inhumane conditions.
Joe Biden can't say that because of the iron grip that AIPAC has on him and everybody around him.
I suppose so. We pay lip service to aid, but we know the aid will not reach the people because the Israelis aren't going to admit the aid to Gaza. We're sort of fantasizing in two different directions. On one hand, we're fantasizing we're helping Israel to defend itself, but obviously this is far beyond self-defense. On the other hand, we're insisting that we support aid for the people of Gaza who are suffering, but we know it's not going to get there. the whole thing is a travesty. It's tragic. And before this is through, I'm sure another 100,000 people at least will lose their lives, maybe more.
Just a question or two about King Abdullah. Is he a real king, a real and total monarch, or is he a figurehead like Charles III
No.
in Great Britain? And what kind of a military does he have, and would he ever use it?
No, he's the real thing. He actually leads his country, and he controls the reins of power. He guides the parliament. He respects the parliament. He discusses with his advisors and members of parliament, but he is the king. He has been devoted to peace with Israel to the point where he's held together a population that on the one hand is descended from the original inhabitants, which we would call originally Bedou or Bedouin tribesmen, and also to millions of Palestinians who have fled into his country from Israel. That's not an easy task right now. The Palestinians who are there would like to arm up, cross the river, and fight with their brethren in the West Bank against Israel. They know what's happening in the West Bank. They know what's happening in Gaza. He does have a good military. It's obviously a little smaller than what we would call the Marine Corps, and although it has more armor than the Marines do, but he's not in a position to take on the Israeli Defense Force alone. And I don't think he wants to. I think he recognizes that if war breaks out like that, it'll be regional in a very short period of time. But I think he and the president of Egypt are both on the verge of breaking their relations with us. And there are lots of people in Washington say, well, that won't happen. But the same people in Washington that insist that there will be no regional war, that nothing will happen to disrupt Israeli operations in Gaza or anywhere else, that the entire region will stand by while hundreds of thousands of people are slaughtered, are also, in most cases, the same people that told me there would be no war in eastern Ukraine, and that the Russians would never dare to enter Ukraine, because if they did, they would fail miserably, their economy would be destroyed, and Mr. Putin would be removed from power. So those two groups are the same. My position is very different. I think this is the most dangerous point in the region's history for hundreds of years, but particularly in the last 70 years for Israel. There's by no means any certainty that Israel will come out of this victorious, safe, secure, and whole. In other words, the very thing that they are striving to achieve, which is perfect security for their population, is the last thing that they'll get, if any.
Before we go, I just want to show you something for humor or mockery. I hope that someday you become the Secretary of State of the United States or Secretary of Defense. And if you do, when you retire, I don't think you'll behave like the dancing Pompeo. That, of course, is Mike Pompeo, the former director of the CIA and the former Secretary of State of the United States under President Trump, dancing with IDF soldiers who are celebrating God only knows what at one of the relief stations made available to them. I don't know the significance of this flag or scarf put on his shoulders, but there he is, Colonel. I guess for domestic American political purposes. Why else would you look so foolish?
Well, give the man credit. He's lost a lot of weight.
Yes, he has. I will give him credit for that.
He's not as plump as he once was. Now, he doesn't seem to be very fast on his feet. He has trouble with rhythm and so forth. It looks a little lost there. He's being dragged around the dance floor. Look, this is signaling you put me into power, and I will make sure that I give everything there is and more to Israel, and more important, I will see to it that it's defended with the lives of American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in perpetuity. He understands something that we've heard before routinely, and that is that donors win elections, not voters. Unfortunately, that's what we've discovered over the last 20 years pretty consistently, don't you think?
Yes, I do think that's the inescapable lesson of American politics in the post-World War II era. Colonel Macgregor, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much. I know we went over time a little bit, but thank you very much for your time and for your thoughts and for your analysis, as always.
Sure. See you in the future.
Of course. All the best.
Thanks for sticking with us all the way to the end. Please subscribe, like, and comment. Make sure bell notification icon is on if you don't want to miss any of our future content.
Welcome to the show. Colonel Macgregor joins us again. Colonel, my deep and profound gratitude for your coming back on the show, having already been on this week, but events are happening very quickly, some of which you pointed out to me, and for the discussion of all of which we, the viewers and I, are deeply grateful. We have a number of things to discuss. A Turkish flotilla of 1,000 boats is making its way to the shores of Gaza. President Putin has told BRICS and other leaders that the violence in Gaza has to stop or it's going to extend. And there's even a bit of a warning there for unnamed Western forces that he believes want to exacerbate things. And as we speak, a car has exploded at the Canadian United States border, and the FBI is all over it. It is not known if this is an accident or if this is an act of terror. We may know more about it before the show is over. Let's start with the flotilla. How can you put together 1,000 boats, and what is the goal of this, and how reminiscent, Colonel, is it of what happened in 2010 when Israeli commandos killed Turkish sailors?
Well, it's not reminiscent in one sense. This is much larger than what went forward in the past. The Turks have tried to provide humanitarian aid to Gaza on several occasions. The Israelis have frequently embargoed, especially from the sea, anything going in or coming out of Gaza. And so in 2010, some IDF commandos landed on board the ship. And as you pointed out, 10 people were killed, and some of them were Turkish soldiers. They were all Turkish citizens, and that had a really terrible impact in Turkey. It really shook the whole nation. It could not understand why it was necessary to use deadly force to stop that humanitarian aid from reaching Muslim Arabs in Gaza. This is much larger, and we need to understand what this is about. This is not an accident. Mr. Erdogan probably had this round in the chamber ready to fire. And what he's doing is, it's not so much Israel. Clearly, he wants to send aid to Gaza. That's indisputable. Makes good sense. But what he's really doing, Judge, is that he's saying something to us. And what he's saying is this. We know that once we launch this flotilla, that we are likely to have problems with the Israelis, who are probably going to try and stop us from getting through. We expect that. The question is, Washington, D.C., President Biden, Senate and House, what are you going to do? Are you going to let this train wreck in Gaza continue down the tracks until it crashes at the bottom of a long, deep ravine? Or are you going to finally pick up the phone and say, enough, no more, it's got to stop? And we don't know yet. What we know, as I've said before, and I think others have pointed this out, that right now, the single most powerful political figure and decision maker in Washington, D.C. is Mr. Netanyahu, not Mr. Biden, nor anyone in the Senate or the House. In fact, the Senate and the House are falling all over each other to provide Mr. Netanyahu anything he wants, to do whatever he wants. I don't know what Mr. Biden really thinks, and we've talked about that before. So the question is, what about it? Are we going to stop the train wreck? Are we going to try and keep this from going completely off the rails and exploding, which is really what Mr. Putin is saying is going to happen? Or are we going to do nothing and leave it to Mr. Netanyahu to decide?
Before we get to President Putin, tell us about the Israeli Navy. Is the Israeli military, I'll use the generic word, so focused on Gaza that this border, which is the seashore, is exposed? Is it really concerned about a flotilla of non-military ships there trying to bring supplies? Or is there a more sinister purpose here behind President Erdogan or whoever organized this thing? They're obviously NGOs. These are not military ships. These are civilian boats, as I understand. Some personal, some commercial, but 1,000 is a lot. Is that goal to clog the Israeli ports and prevent the people of Israel from receiving goods and supplies, much as the Israeli government is preventing the people of Gaza from receiving goods and supplies.
No, not at all. The Turks have made it very clear they have no intention whatsoever, no malicious intent, if you will, towards the Israelis. Absolutely not. These are unarmed vessels. Just as the vessel back in 2010 was unarmed. So I see no evidence for that at all. I think it's exactly what I said. This has less to do with the Israelis than it does to do with Washington. We are the ones who control the cards in the game as far as Israel is concerned. We are Israel's only friend and true ally. Now, others will profess it, but let's be frank, we are it. We're the ones who have provided the military backstop to whatever Mr. Netanyahu wants to do. You know, go back to 2000, 2001, there were incursions into Gaza made by Ariel Sharon. They went in there, they destroyed some buildings, bulldozed things. Soon the phone rang in Tel Aviv, and Sharon listened to the President of the United States on the other end. At the time, it was W., the second Bush. And he said, look, Ariel, you can't do this. You're going to make more enemies than you need. This has to stop. We're trying to negotiate and work out a deal. You've got to pull those forces out right away. By the way, the Israeli generals at the time also made the same recommendation to Ariel Sharon, saying, don't go in there and don't do this. It's not going to help us. We don't have that now. There's nobody at the other end of the phone line capable of saying anything other than, yes, Mr. Netanyahu. Yes, Mr. Netanyahu. So this is not about harming Israelis at all. That's the last thing that Mr. Erdogan wants to become involved with. This is about providing aid, but it's a stalking horse to find out what's really going to happen in Washington, to show the world who's really in charge.
Well, in 2010, the Israeli commandos stormed the ship. Chris, if you want to put it up again, they killed 10 Turkish soldiers. Through some means, either negotiation or litigation, the Israeli government paid $10 million to the Turkish government, theoretically to be distributed to the families of those that were killed. Do you expect a confrontation like that this time? Will the Israelis do everything they can to prevent these NGOs, non-government organizations, from delivering food, water, and fuel to the poor people in Gaza?
I don't know, but I suspect there will be an attempt to minimize it, if not stop it altogether, because the Israelis are at war. Their view is that they face an existential threat from Gaza in the form of Hamas. Now, keep in mind that Hamas is a school of fish swimming in an ocean. In order to get to Hamas, get the school of fish, you have to drain the ocean. Now, whether or not they'll ever get to that school of fish is open to debate, but Mr. Netanyahu is draining the ocean. He wants to expel that population. That's the point. Now, some people want to call it genocide. I'm reluctant to use that word. I think expulsion is certainly justified, and there's plenty of evidence, as you pointed out the other day, especially with regard to that refugee camp, for some decisions that certainly are criminal or at least border on it. But the bottom line is that that's what he's up to. That's what he wants to do. He has the backing of probably 85% of the Jewish electorate. They've had it with Hamas. They've had it with Gaza. So the only way this stops, as Mr. Erdogan knows, is for the President of the United States to intervene and stop it. So that's what this flotilla is really all about.
While all this is happening, President Putin spoke to a group of BRICS leaders and religious leaders, and he told them that he condemns collective punishment. So, Chris, Russian President Vladimir Putin speaking with the President of South Africa.
We call for joint efforts of the international community aimed at de-escalating the situation, a ceasefire, and finding a political solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And the BRICS states and countries of the region could play a key role in this work.
How significant is it that Vladimir Putin, on the cusp of a triumph in Ukraine, has weighed in on this at its hottest moments?
Well, we shouldn't be surprised. We've done everything in our power to transform Russia into an implacable enemy of the United States. We've poured buckets of filth and abuse all over Putin's head, condemned him as a criminal, described him in terms I wouldn't use for my mother-in-law. And
You won't go there.
the bottom line is that he's sending another signal, though, and he's right to do this. He's saying, look, this is not going to be contained. You're on a road to spreading this conflict, because Putin is being in touch with Erdogan, Raisi, Nasrallah, Assad, the King of Jordan, General Sisi, all the principal figures in this drama. So he knows how serious this is. We're the ones that refuse to take this as seriously as it should be taken. And this is my concern about Israel. The Israelis aren't taking it seriously. They think they've got us and that we can stop anything. We can't stop anything. In other words, if this runs out of control, we are limited in what we can do. And the Israelis don't seem to understand that. The American people, I don't think, are even engaged. And so he's really speaking to Washington, and he's trying to say, look, this is very dangerous. And by the way, you can infer from this that he will stand behind Iran and potentially Turkey and the others in the region if they are drawn into the conflict with Israel and the United States.
Colonel, does stand behind mean PR statements or military stand behind?
I think it also involves military power, just as we are involved militarily with Israel. And I think we have to take that into consideration. It's not something that he's going to look for as an opportunity. Right. But he's not going to let Iran be destroyed by us. He's not going to stand by and allow Turkey to take a beating if they both end up in conflict with Israel.
I'm reading from the reporter from Al Jazeera who was in the room. In remarks that criticized the West, he, Putin, said certain unnamed forces were seeking to provoke further escalation and to draw as many other countries and peoples into the conflict as possible. Gee, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. I wonder who he was aiming that at.
Yeah, that's pretty obvious. And how many times have people pointed out who has been intervening all over the world repeatedly in the affairs of other countries?
Right.
And we are seen consequently in a very negative light. And the grievances people have against us go back to the 1950s. When you talk to Iranians, they'll take you through the whole chapter and verse of what's been going on there since the 50s regarding our interference in their internal affairs. Remember that both the the Chinese and the Russians have made it clear on repeated occasions that they will do business with people, they will cooperate with people, they will help and assist people. They will not intervene in the internal affairs of other countries.
Colonel, here's South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, who was more direct than President Putin and who spoke at the same conference right after President Putin did.
The collective punishment of Palestinian civilians through the unlawful use of force by Israel is a war crime. The deliberate denial of medicine, fuel, food, and water to the residents of Gaza is tantamount to genocide.
Is that the way, I know South Africa's not in the region, but is that the way regional leaders feel?
Oh, I think so. I don't think there's any question about it. He's simply echoing the sentiments of virtually all of the Arab states, the Iranians, the Turks, the states in North Africa, Central and South Africa. Everyone is watching this. The Chinese certainly are. And remember, these are people who've lived in countries where those things were denied from time to time for various reasons, wars or authoritarian governments. They know what that means. They know what famines do. They understand what mass deportations mean, mass expulsions. All of these people have been through these things. So unsurprisingly, they're very sympathetic to the Arab population in Gaza.
I want to go back to Turkey for a minute. A question from one of our viewers. Turkey's a member of NATO. What happens if Turkey gets in some kind of a conflagration with the IDF, whether it's over these boats or not.
You know, the whole NATO question probably deserves a lot more attention and a lengthier discussion than you're going to get it here. But I think we need to understand something. NATO is emerging from this operation in Ukraine with a lot of blood on its hands and a very serious black eye. You had Stoltenberg, who just a few months ago said, if we lose, in other words, we, NATO, are seen as losing in Ukraine, it could have ugly consequences for the future of the alliance. Well, I don't think the alliance, strictly speaking, has much future. If you are living in Eastern Europe right now or anywhere on the Russian periphery, and you truly believe that in the event of a conflict that might erupt on your borders, that the United States is going to send forces in a timely manner to rescue you in a war, you are probably delusional, because we can't. We can send something eventually, but not enough to make any difference quickly. And now we have Ukraine, where we built a force from the ground up over the period of, 8 years? We equipped it better than most forces in the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, and it lost. It didn't simply lose, it was utterly annihilated. The true scale of the defeat is not known in the West. Everyone's gone to great lengths to suppress the information to conceal the tragedy. The Ukrainian nation is destroyed. Now, I'm not saying that the Russians have any interest in Eastern Europe. I don't think they have any interest whatsoever in moving in that direction. I think they'd like to do business with everybody.
Right.
But we're busy insisting that you can't cooperate or work with us unless you have a government and a society that looks like us. Assuming that we look all that good, that's another matter.
Right.
That's our attitude. That's crazy.
Yeah.
You know, why have we cooperated over the years with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia if it didn't fit our notions of what is right and what is wrong? Well, whatever you want to say, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has turned out to be a very stable society with a stable government.
Here's President Xi of China. Their translation is written, so I will read it aloud for the benefit of our friends and colleagues who are experiencing Judging Freedom audio only. The root cause of the Palestinian-Israeli situation is the fact that the right of the Palestinian people to statehood, their right to existence, and their right of return have long been ignored. I have emphasized on many occasions that the only viable way to break the cycle of Palestinian-Israeli conflict lies in the two-state solution, in the restoration of the legitimate national rights of Palestine, and in the establishment of an independent state of Palestine. There can be no sustainable peace and security in the Middle East without a just Palestine. China calls for early convening of an international peace conference. China calls for an early convening of an international peace conference that is more authoritative, to build international consensus for peace and work toward an early solution to the question of Palestine that is comprehensive, just, and sustainable. Are you surprised that he has weighed in directly like this and that he has said more clearly than anybody that the Palestinian people are entitled to an independent country with all the rights of sovereignty?
A retired general of the Israeli Defense Force several years ago said to me as I was driving with him along the Golan Heights, he said, "You know, Douglas, we should have gone to Madagascar." Now, most of your audience will not understand what that means, but at the time when the Zionist movement was taking off, there were lots of discussions about where should we Jews go. And one of the destinations was Madagascar. There was absolutely no determination early on for any reason that it absolutely desperately needed to be in the Middle East and in Palestine, or what we call Palestine, certainly since the Roman Empire. His point was simple. You know, look, if we'd gone somewhere else, we probably would have been far happier and far more successful, because we were planted in a region where from the moment we arrived, we were treated as a bacillus, as an infection. Mr. Netanyahu has acknowledged this. He has said publicly, this is a civilizational conflict. He is correct. Israel is not, strictly speaking, a Middle Eastern state. It's an extension of the West. It is a Jewish form of Western civilization, but it is nevertheless an extension of it. It is not part of the Islamic world, and the Islamic world has never accepted it. So the problem I have with what Mr. Xi is saying, not with his ultimate purpose, but he needs to point out that from the moment they arrived, the Jews were unwanted. They were under assault. And so they seized what they have by force. And we, and to a lesser extent, the British, have helped them to stay there and flourish and survive. But 75 years later, the same condition that made them unwelcome is still there. It hasn't changed. But the quality and the capabilities of their adversaries or potential opponents, those things have improved dramatically. And they can no longer play off the various actors against each other, which they've done very successfully for many years. Now, the last point is this. Mr. Xi said something that's very important, and I absolutely agree with the president on this. President Xi said, an authoritative conference. In other words, an outcome that can be imposed on the people in the region. That is the way that issues have been settled, certainly in Europe for centuries, and I would argue to some extent in Asia for centuries. In other words, we're not going to tolerate any more squabbling or conflict. This is how it's going to be. The great powers stepped up and imposed it.
But will there be an authoritative imposition of the state of Israel while Bibi Netanyahu and the independent state of Palestine, while Bibi Netanyahu is the prime minister of Israel?
No, but it also won't. No authoritative solution will be imposed as long as we are heavily engaged, because we are unambiguously on Israel's side. Right. And again, as I've said before, I support Israel as well. Unfortunately, I think at this stage, it should be pretty clear to everyone that the two-state solution is dead. I don't know why people keep bringing it up, because one of the things that Mr. Netanyahu set out to do was to destroy it. Remember, I pointed out that the danger here is that the Israelis have burned several bridges behind them. In other words, they crossed the Rubicon and they can't go back. They can't go back now.
Right. Well, you say it's dead. Then how significant is it that both Vladimir Putin and President Xi call for it on an international forum at the same day at the height of the war in Gaza?
Part of it is a certain amount, I think, of cynicism, because they know it is fundamentally unacceptable to the Israelis, and as a result, we probably won't support it. But they also feel that a great injustice has been inflicted on the Arabs in Palestine. Okay. And they are correct. The Arabs have suffered an injustice. This injustice is very old, go all the way back 75 years. There's no question about it. But that's not going to change. Because you now have a state in the region. And the key question is this. All right, Hamas, under what conditions can you live in peace with Israel? Answer that question. Then you turn to Mr. Netanyahu and say, Mr. Netanyahu, under what conditions can you and your government live peacefully with your neighbors, specifically the Muslim Arabs on the West Bank and those in Gaza? They've got to answer those questions. Until you've answered those questions honestly and openly, it's pointless to hold a conference.
Last subject, I'm checking my iPhone. I don't see anything new on the explosion at the American-Canadian border, but you seemed very concerned about this when we emailed each other before we came on air. Do you know any more about it, Colonel?
No, but my concern stems from the following. Go back to 2001. When that tragedy in New York occurred, the very first action that was required was not to invade someone else's country. It was to close our borders, secure our ports and airports, and find out who was actually in the country. We didn't do that. What we did was talk about invading other people's countries, Afghanistan and ultimately Iraq. And that was a serious mistake. I don't know what will happen now, but I do remember sitting on an aircraft flying down to CENTCOM in January of 2002 and having a short, amicable, but nevertheless short argument with a passenger who kept saying, this is Iraq. They're behind this. We need to get rid of these Muslims. We need to get rid of these Arabs. And I said, well, first of all, I don't know who was on the airplane, but it remains to be seen that Iraq or anybody else had anything to do with this. Haven't you ever heard of anything called Al-Qaeda? Of course, that went nowhere. And that was an advantage for the people in the Bush administration who wanted desperately to march into the Middle East. Well, we marched in, and it was a catastrophe. And we never needed to go in the great numbers that we did in Afghanistan. And everyone with experience in the region said, you could go in there with a large enough supply of gold and buy Osama and his friends from the locals because they're not Afghans, and ultimately they'll sell them to us. No one would listen to that. Everyone wanted the grandiose gesture of bombing and strafing and
shock and awe. Yes. Colonel, before we go, you have an interesting interview yourself this weekend with one of the most fascinating persons, a friend of mine, as you know, on the American political scene. Tell us what this is and where and when we can watch the interview.
Well, we'll be on Rumble, and ultimately I'm sure it'll find its way onto other places, including YouTube, and eventually on our website, Our Country, Our Choice. So you can go for directions to ourcountryourchoice.com, or you can go on Rumble and search. The interview was actually conducted on Friday at about 4:40 till about 5:15. And my objective at the time was to create the opportunity for the candidate for president who was independent to talk about what he wanted to do, particularly in the opening stages of his administration, and to talk a little bit about what was important to him and what he thought we needed. I think Americans who watch it will find it very interesting and very uplifting because it is ultimately a different way of speaking. It's nothing like what you heard from the various Republican candidates for president, or for that matter, from anybody else on the Democratic side. Completely.
He certainly has a different way of speaking. There's no question about that.
Yep. And I think people will really like it. I was impressed. I don't know him very well, but I was very impressed, and I think most people will be.
We're speaking, of course, of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Colonel, thank you for your time today. Good luck with that interview.
Thank you for sticking with us all the way to the end. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Make sure the notification bell is turned on so you don't miss any important news. Thank you for sticking with us all the way to the end. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Make sure the notification bell